Let's take a look at working with quadratic functions. Quadratic functions, you have a basic formula for all quadratics. It has to have a squared in it. That's probably the most important thing. So if you get any kind of formula that has either a cube or a square root, that's not a quadratic. This is the quadratic, has to have a square. We have a specific name for something that looks like this. It's called a parabola, and we'll be talking about that a little later on. So what I've got here is I've got a nice little table of values that you can see here all the way down, here. I took some basic numbers of x, and I'm just going to plug it into the formula. So if you look at this, this means minus 3 squared. You'll find out that that's 9. You're going to see that that's minus 2 squared. That's going to be 4. You're going to get minus 1 squared, which is going to be equal to 1. 0 squared, our favorite, of course, is going to be 0. 1 squared is going to be 1. And look how it repeats itself, which is kind of interesting to see. That you see this has the same value here as it would be here. So when you're plotting this, it becomes really, really interesting to plot, and you get a very, very nice looking parabola. So there's your 0, 0 starting right there. This, of course, now is minus 3, 9. So minus 1, 2, 3, and going all the way up to 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's your parabola that looks like that. You're going to get a minus 2, 4, minus 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. There's your other point. You're going to get to minus 1, 1, and 0, 0. And then you're going to find out it's exactly the same points, just going the opposite direction. So if you were actually to put a graph down, it would look very, very much like this. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a parabola. That's what it's all about, okay? So whenever you get a quadratic in this particular course, you will always get this beautiful looking parabola. So let's take a look and see what we can do when we start playing around with these things. The whole idea here is we're going to put numbers in front of that x squared, and the whole purpose of this podcast is to figure out what is that number in front going to do to our wonderful little parabola. So when a equals to 1, we know that this is y equals 1x squared, which is just basically y equals x squared, which is our standard little parabola that we drew just a few moments ago that looked like this. But now let's start playing with this a. Let's say a now equals to minus 1x squared. Well, what I want to do here is I want to show you graphically on your calculator what this thing does. Now I just happen to have the calculator running in the background here. I'm ready to go. So I'm going to substitute this value in of negative x squared into this calculator, and I want to show you how this graph looks like. Take a look at the graph now. So it's exactly the same one as you had before. It's exactly the same parabola that you had before, but now it's flipped upside down. So we basically can draw it this way like this. Boom. And I know I'm not very accurate with my drawing, but you get the general idea. So let's take a look at the next page here, which is kind of neat. Let's play with these numbers even a little bit more. So what happens when the a is a big number? So let's look. Let's pick a big number. Let's say a is 5. So I'm going to put 5x squared here. And let's go back to our calculator and let's play around. Let's see what happens. Go back to y equals 2 here, and you'll find out we're going to clear this, and we're going to put in 5x squared as our value. And let's see what happens to the graph. When you graph this, you're going to find out something very interesting. Now, we have nothing to compare to, so you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into this y equals 2. I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to just put down the x squared to show you what this looked like originally. So we now have our original parabola, and now we have the 5x squared parabola. And let's graph this. And you'll see the normal parabola was looking like that, and the 5x squared parabola is actually thinner. So you've got a much, much, much more narrower looking graph here. So this thing actually, the number up front actually makes this thing look thin. All right? That's what happens to it. Let's keep on going. What happens when we have this as a fraction? Well, let's pick a fraction. Y equals to, let's say, 1/2 x squared, and let's see what happens. Let's boot back our calculator. There's our calculator, and I'm just going to clear these values again. Let's clear this first value. So we have our normal parabola sitting there like we always do. Let's throw in 1/2, and let's see exactly what happens to our parabola when we put in 1/2. All right, so brackets 1. Oops, I put 2 brackets in. Let's clear this again. Brackets 1 divided by 2 bracket x squared. Now you remember what our old parabola looked like. Look what happens now with our new parabola. There it is. So what happens is our new parabola actually gets a little bit wider. So when this thing becomes a fraction, I always like to exaggerate it a little bit so you can actually see. This with a big number, right, gets thin. This with a small number, a fraction, gets wide. All right, so let's play around with this idea now in terms of our next slide. The whole idea here is to play around. What's going to happen when it is negative and 1/2? So negative and 1/2. Now think about this. What does the negative do? The negative tells you to flip. So it's going to be a parabola that looks upside down like this, and the 1/2 tells you it's going to be fat. So it's not only going to be upside down, but it's going to actually be nice and fat here. So that's what we're after. So let's see what happens here when we put this in. So it's going to be negative, and it's going to be fat. So remember, what did our normal parabola look like? Our normal parabola looks something like this. This, in fact, is negative, which means it's flipped, and 1/2, which means it's, I like to call it fat. Okay? So here we go. Let's go back to our calculator, and let's actually plot that in there. So let's put it the y equals 2. Let's get rid of this one here. So we still have our normal parabola going that way. There's our x squared parabola. Let's go back and let's put into here bracket negative 1 divided by 2 bracket x squared. And let's prove that this is actually fatter and upside down. There she be. Okay, so a couple things to kind of make sure that you keep note of. Now, let's go and let's take a look at one more thing. Let's take a look at a summary then. So if it's A is positive, it opens up. Okay, and our parabola looks like this. And the way you can think of about this is very, very simple. This looks like a happy face. It's a happy parabola. It's positive. Okay, here's our negative parabola, which is opening down. Right? So opening down means it's unhappy. So it's a negative parabola. If it is a big number, we have to remember that it's very thin. So thin it is. Okay? And if it's a fraction, we say that it's very wide. So that basically wraps up everything that we're going to do on this particular one. We'll do more later.